File 39 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager, Book 1, Part 4, Section 7. Conclusion of this book. But before I launch out into those immense depths of philosophy which lie before me, I find myself inclined to stop a moment in my present station and to ponder that voyage which I have undertaken, and which undoubtedly requires the utmost art and industry to be brought to a happy conclusion. Methinks I am like a man who, having struck on many shoals, and having narrowly escaped shipwreck in passing a small frith, has yet the temerity to put out to sea in the same leaky, weather-beaten vessel, and even carries his ambition so far as to think of compassing the globe under these disadvantageous circumstances. My memory of past errors and perplexities makes me diffident for the future. The wretched condition, weakness, and disorder of the faculties I must employ in my inquiries increase my apprehensions, and the impossibility of amending or correcting these faculties reduces me almost to despair, and makes me resolve to perish on the barren rock on which I am at present, rather than venture myself upon that boundless ocean which runs out into immensity. This sudden view of my danger strikes me with melancholy, and as it is usual for that passion above all others to indulge itself, I cannot forbear feeding my despair with all those desponding reflections which the present subject furnishes me with in such abundance. I am first affrighted and confounded with that forlorn solitude in which I am placed in my philosophy, and fancy myself some strange, uncouth monster who, not being able to mingle and unite in society, has been expelled all human commerce and left utterly abandoned and disconsolate. Fain would I run into the crowd for shelter and warmth, but cannot prevail with myself to mix with such deformity. I call upon others to join me in order to make a company apart, but no one will hearken to me. Every one keeps at a distance, and dreads that storm which beats upon me from every side. I have exposed myself to the enmity of all metaphysicians, logicians, mathematicians, and even theologians, and can I wonder at the insults I must suffer? I have declared my disapprobation of their systems, and can I be surprised if they should express a hatred of mine and of my person? When I look abroad, I foresee on every side dispute, contradiction, anger, calumny, and detraction. When I turn my eye inward, I find nothing but doubt and ignorance. All the world conspires to oppose and contradict me, though such is my weakness that I feel all my opinions loosen and fall of themselves when unsupported by the approbation of others. Every step I take is with hesitation, and every new reflection makes me dread an error and absurdity in my reasoning. For with what confidence can I venture upon such bold enterprises when, beside those numberless infirmities peculiar to myself, I find so many which are common to human nature? Can I be sure that in leaving all established opinions I am following truth? And by what criterion shall I distinguish her, even if fortune should at last guide me on her footsteps? After the most accurate and exact of my reasonings, I can give no reason why I should assent to it, and feel nothing but a strong propensity to consider objects strongly in that view under which they appear to me. Experience is a principle which instructs me in the several conjunctions of objects for the past. Habit is another principle which determines me to expect the same for the future, and both of them conspiring to operate upon the imagination make me form certain ideas in a more intense and lively manner than others, which are not attended with the same advantages. Without this quality by which the mind enlivens some ideas beyond others, which seemingly is so trivial and so little founded on reason, we could never assent to any argument nor carry our view beyond those few objects which are present to our senses. Nay, even to these objects we could never attribute any existence but what was dependent on the senses, and must comprehend them entirely in that succession of perceptions which constitutes our self or person. Nay, farther, even with relation to that succession, we could only admit of those perceptions which are immediately present to our consciousness, nor could those lively images with which the memory presents us be ever received as true pictures of past perceptions. The memory, senses, and understanding are, therefore, all of them founded on the imagination, or the vivacity of our ideas.
I'm not sure I'm completely sure what, I'm not sure I'm sure. I'm not sure what to think of this. It seems like somebody who's struggling to, get recognition amongst his circles. Let me see here. There was some particular. I am first affrighted and confounded with that forlorn solitude in which I am placed in my philosophy, and fancy myself some strange uncouth monster who, not being able to mingle and unite in society, has been expelled all human commerce and left utterly abandoned and disconsolate. Fain would I run into the crowd for shelter and warmth, but cannot prevail with myself to mix with such deformity. Call upon others to join me in order to make a company apart, but no one will hearken to me. Everyone keeps at a distance and dreads that storm which beats upon me from every side. I have exposed myself to the enmity of all metaphysicians, logicians, mathematicians, even theologians. And I wonder at the insults I must suffer. So there's some frustration, obviously. But he's speaking, straight out of the bag. So that's a kind of, I would think, a kind of rare honesty for those times. But that's a part of being a philosopher, right? Philosophers have never been popular unless they're the popular philosophers and they're towing the party line, right? Always, right? Those who are in the ivory towers, it's usually those who toe the line of those powers that should not be, right? Those in power who, academia, whatever, right? Whatever it is, those who are popular are those who toe the line. Those who are actually trying to get to the real philosophy, the good philosophy, the honest philosophy, and the rigid philosophy, they will inevitably point out various parts of this structure that might not be that moral when when you sort of get to it, right? and therefore they're sort of pushed out of the way. They shouldn't criticize the status quo. They're rocking the boat and all that, right? And it's just a recurring thing. And you know, it's like Socrates, right? They fucking murdered him for speaking his mind, right? And it's sort of haunting. It's a ghost in philosophy that it's a pointer that is almost 2.5 centuries old, that those who stick out get their heads cut off, right? You can't criticize the power structure, right? You can't philosophize in a way that might be neutral, but might end up, pointing implicitly in certain directions that wouldn't be too good, right? For those who are either dependent on the power or are the actual power, right? So, welcome to the club, Hume, right? So I'm not necessarily, but I have a, when you speak your mind, right? And there's a certain point where people suddenly realize that you have a particular ability and approach and an honesty and a directness maybe that they sense is different from the usual individual, right? Who toe the party line, right? Go along to get along, right? At some point you might end up people saying, okay, there's something about him or her. It could be a her also, right? Usually a him, I would say. And they are sort of keeping the distance, right? They don't want to associate, sort of. Maybe nowadays it's easier to try to keep a low profile in certain avenues of your life, but I can associate with it this feeling of when you reach a certain point, people turn off, right? They turn off and say, okay, I'm not, fuck you, and they're not saying it necessarily, but it's like the human connection is shut down, right? If you criticize a particular structure that they have spent most of their life trying to fit into, trying to point that out and create some kind of cognitive dissonance, they will reject you usually, right? So, I mean, it's just what it is. I mean, and if you are not willing to go there, you will never become a good philosopher, right? I mean, you can philosophize sitting alone on a deserted island, more or less metaphorically, but there is this thing about presenting your philosophy. It's just something that comes with the notion. I don't think you can. I mean, if you come up with a good idea, right? Why not share it? If you come up with something you find to be better than what is already out there, why not share it, right? It doesn't mean that you have to force it down people's throats. But on the other hand, man, right? I mean, if nobody says anything, right, where does it all end, right? There have been some incidents in the 20th century, also in other centuries. But, there were some very serious incidents and events in the 20th century that might not have been the same or quite as severe if there was a few more philosophers who had the balls to go where they thought they should go, just like Hume, and rather sitting there hiding in the ivory tower, making sure that they can get their whatever, university money, whatever, right? And not saying anything that might be controversial, and the powers that be would sort of put the searchlight or the big eye would look at them, right? So, yeah, I never hear much of the big philosophers wondering about what happened in the 20th century. It's all sort of these cloud castles of, sort of disconnected from much of what has been going on. It's sort of I'm not saying that necessarily aren't anybody thinking about it and reflecting on it, but it's not. It's like to me that academia and academic philosophy is disconnected from everyday life. They're living in some cloud over here, and they're sitting smelling each other's farts and maybe mostly their own farts, right? And sort of sending out some harebrained articles that nobody understands now and then, and say, I've done it, right? And just take a look at I was considering doing a small podcast on meta ethics. Take a look at a diagram of how to get through meta ethics, right? It's like, holy frick, man, right? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. This is what happens when over academic and sort of extreme intelligence knocks itself out in abstractions and have lost connection with anything you could call a real world, right? It's ridiculous. Nobody can use it for anything. It's useless. It's completely useless, right? It's just frustrating that when I check out, for instance, YouTube, try to find something that really has some meat on it, right? Somebody really presenting their own philosophy. There aren't that many of them, right? And those I can find usually have some weird ideas, right? Quite strange and weird and so on, right? So nobody's like sort of down-to-earth guy like Hume here, right? So it's sorely missing, in my opinion, right? I do my best to bring some opinions and philosophy to the table there, right? But I'm let it be there. I was just and now I forgot where the hell I was in the text. But let's just hear the words then. I'll try to find the text.
No wonder a principle so inconstant and fallacious should lead us into errors when implicitly followed, as it must be, in all its variations. It is this principle which makes us reason from causes and effects. And it is the same principle which convinces us of the continued existence of external objects when absent from the senses. But though these two operations be equally natural and necessary in the human mind, yet in some circumstances they are, see section 4, directly contrary. Nor is it possible for us to reason justly and regularly from causes and effects, and at the same time believe the continued existence of matter. How then shall we adjust those principles together? Which of them shall we prefer? Or in case we prefer neither of them, but successively assent to both, as is usual among philosophers, with what confidence can we afterwards usurp that glorious title when we thus knowingly embrace a manifest contradiction? This contradiction, see Part 3, Section 14, would be more excusable were it compensated by any degree of solidity and satisfaction in the other parts of our reasoning. But the case is quite contrary. When we trace up the human understanding to its first principles, we find it to lead us into such sentiments as seem to turn into ridicule all our past pains and industry, and to discourage us from future inquiries. Nothing is more curiously inquired after by the mind of man than the causes of every phenomenon, nor are we content with knowing the immediate causes, but push on our inquiries till we arrive at the original and ultimate principle. We would not willingly stop before we are acquainted with that energy in the cause by which it operates on its effect, that tie which connects them together, and that efficacious quality on which the tie depends. This is our aim in all our studies and reflections. And how must we be disappointed when we learn that this connection, tie, or energy lies merely in ourselves and is nothing but that determination of the mind which is acquired by custom and causes us to make a transition from an object to its usual attendant, and from the impression of one to the lively idea of the other. Such a discovery not only cuts off all hope of ever attaining satisfaction, but even prevents our very wishes, since it appears that when we say we desire to know the ultimate and operating principle as something which resides in the external object, we either contradict ourselves or talk without a meaning. This deficiency in our ideas is not, indeed, perceived in common life, nor are we sensible that in the most usual conjunctions of cause and effect, we are as ignorant of the ultimate principle which binds them together as in the most unusual and extraordinary. But this proceeds merely from an illusion of the imagination, and the question is how far we ought to yield to these illusions. This question is very difficult, and reduces us to a very dangerous dilemma, whichever way we answer it. For if we assent to every trivial suggestion of the fancy, beside that these suggestions are often contrary to each other, they lead us into such errors, absurdities, and obscurities that we must at last become ashamed of our credulity. Nothing is more dangerous to reason than the flights of the imagination, and nothing has been the occasion of more mistakes among philosophers. Men of bright fancies may in this respect be compared to those angels whom the Scripture represents as covering their eyes with their wings. This has already appeared in so many instances that we may spare ourselves the trouble of enlarging upon it any further. But on the other hand, if the consideration of these instances makes us take a resolution to reject all the trivial suggestions of the fancy and adhere to the understanding, that is, to the general and more established properties of the imagination, even this resolution, if steadily executed, would be dangerous and attended with the most fatal consequences. For I have already shewn, see section 1, that the understanding, when it acts alone, and according to its most general principles, entirely subverts itself and leaves not the lowest degree of evidence in any proposition, either in philosophy or common life. We save ourselves from this total skepticism only by means of that singular and seemingly trivial property of the fancy, by which we enter with difficulty into remote views of things, and are not able to accompany them with so sensible an impression as we do those which are more easy and natural. Shall we then establish it for a general maxim that no refined or elaborate reasoning is ever to be received? Consider well the consequences of such a principle. By this means, you cut off entirely all science and philosophy. You proceed upon one singular quality of the imagination, and by a parity of reason must embrace all of them. And you expressly contradict yourself, since this maxim must be built on the preceding reasoning, which will be allowed to be sufficiently refined and metaphysical. What party, then, shall we choose among these difficulties? If we embrace this principle and condemn all refined reasoning, we run into the most manifest absurdities. If we reject it in favor of these reasonings, we subvert entirely the human understanding. We have, therefore, no choice left but betwixt a false reason and none at all. For my part, I know not what ought to be done in the present case. I can only observe what is commonly done, which is that this difficulty is seldom or never thought of, and even where it has once been present to the mind, is quickly forgot, and leaves but a small impression behind it. Very refined reflections have little or no influence upon us, and yet we do not and cannot establish it for a rule that they ought not to have any influence, which implies a manifest contradiction. But what have I here said? That reflections very refined and metaphysical have little or no influence upon us. This opinion I can scarce forbear retracting and condemning from my present feeling and experience. The intense view of these manifold contradictions and imperfections in human reason has so wrought upon me and heated my brain that I am ready to reject all belief and reasoning, and can look upon no opinion even as more probable or likely than another. Where am I, or what? From what causes do I derive my existence, and to what condition shall I return? Whose favor shall I court, and whose anger must I dread? What beings surround me, and on whom have I any influence, or who have any influence on me? I am confounded with all these questions, and begin to fancy myself in the most deplorable condition imaginable, environed with the deepest darkness, and utterly deprived of the use of every member and faculty. Most fortunately, it happens that since reason is incapable of dispelling these clouds, nature herself suffices to that purpose, and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind, or by some avocation and lively impression of my senses, which obliterate all these chimeras. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, and am merry with my friends. And when after 3 or 4 hours' amusement I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any farther. Here then I find myself absolute.
These are some interesting, deep reflections, I must say, right? He's very, very honest about it. Sort of, he's almost self-psychologizing here. I wasn't actually expecting that, I must admit. But I like the honesty. But I'm not sure, I don't want to sound like I'm sort of almost like, what do I care, right? But the frustration of doing philosophy is not itself philosophy. It's something you handle on your own, maybe together with somebody who's good at handling that together with other people. But it's like, I know that there weren't any psychologists or anything like that. That would be the priest usually, right? I would suppose even in Scotland, right? So it's it sounds. I'm not sure it helps. I don't. I mean, I'm looking. I'm personally looking at the arguments. A good argument is a good argument, no matter how who presents it or how it's presented. An argument is an argument. Is it a good argument, valid argument? I'll buy that any day, right? a homeless, poor sod, coming up with a good argument, that's as valid as, the most fancy academic somewhere, right? An argument is an argument. But it's not an argument that you have particular emotions and feeling about doing it, right? Those are not philosophical as such, right? In the sense that it's something that I need. So, I'm just a little confused about these ramblings here, right? I'm not trying to piss on him in any way. I mean, I appreciate the honesty, but I'm not sure what I need them for. So I have some emotion and things I'm, struggling with maybe, right? I'm not saying I necessarily am, but, I suppose that that would be a part of everybody's life, right? And I wouldn't present them in my philosophy because it doesn't concern the philosophy as such, right? If I'm building a house, it's not a part of how to build the house that I have a certain feeling when I use the hammer or something like that. And I have the same approach about philosophy. It should be kind of neutral and pure and straight up and every sort of poetic or psychological or all that shit should be removed from it. Should be pure, clean argumentation, right? In my opinion, right?
And necessarily determined to live and talk and act like other people in the common affairs of life. But notwithstanding that my natural propensity and the course of my animal spirits and passions reduce me to this indolent belief in the general maxims of the world, I still feel such remains of my former disposition that I am ready to throw all my books and papers into the fire, and resolve nevermore to renounce the pleasures of life for the sake of reasoning and philosophy. For those are my sentiments in that splenetic humor which governs me at present. I must yield to the current of nature in submitting to my senses and understanding. And in this blind submission, I shew most perfectly my skeptical disposition and
I mean, nowadays it's a lot easier, potentially at least, to find somebody who might be on the same wavelength as you, right? Philosophically. I'm not saying it's necessarily easy. If you're going for these kinds of foundational stuff in what I would consider the right way, right? And that is the approach that Hume is taking, in my opinion. There is no other way to do it. I mean, the really foundational approach, there might be various variations you could sort of, I would do it slightly differently, but in the overall scope, I would have the same approach as Hume, right? And you will probably not, it will not be easy to find. I mean, if, in my opinion, what my understanding of metaphysics have to be the right approach, because neither of the other main approaches to metaphysics are valid in the way they're doing it, right? Now, and to cut it short, and maybe there's a bit of rambling that doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with this particular part of his book, but the materialism and the idealism, right? The materialism is my experiences is the actual outside of my mind, right? Idealism is, no, I only have an experience inside, but I'm going to tell you about that and outside anyway, and give you an idea what it is. And it's also, they will probably say something that is all made of mind out there, right? So I have my mind, and then there's some external world that is also mind, which my mind is a representation of. And both of these sounds crazy to me, right? They are both crazy. And dualism has been refuted. I mean, materialism seems to try to get rid of mind as an illusion, right? And idealism tries to get rid of matter as a kind of illusion, right? So they want one thing, each of them want one thing to be the ruling thing, right? And the rest is some kind of illusion of something. I'm cutting it very basic here, right? Now I'm in the middle where I say I need both, right? I need an idea of I'm having some experiences, but to give my experiences a purpose, I have to treat them as something that is outside my mind. But they can't be outside my mind if they're an experience. So I can merely treat them as a representation of something outside, right? Therefore, I'm able to say that you are outside and so on and so on and so on, but I'm still working with a representation. My computer is a representation of something outside, right? What I call my computer is a mental picture of whatever that I call a representation of something outside. I can never get to what it is. I'm just calling it computer, and it has these particular sensations, right? And that can, in my opinion, that is the only way to approach it in a rigid manner, where you don't claim more that you or create paradoxes or claim more than you can get away with from a starting point, which is your experiences, right? So,
principles. But does it follow that I must strive against the current of nature, which leads me to indolence and pleasure? That I must...
And the main point of what I was trying to say is that, okay, if you find that to be the right way, right, you rule out bad argumentation and say, no, I have to stay with this, and no, I have to refine it further, it has to be smaller, whatever, how you do it, right? Then you might have ended in a situation where you are basically, possibly, the only one in the world having that philosophy. And you will be rejected because people don't want that philosophy because it doesn't fit their picture or whatever, right? Even if you can argue for it, they have their own more or less sufficient argumentation for their version, and they're sticking to that, right? And there's also this sort of lock-in effect. If you have found some kind of philosophy and you have sort of presented it and written books about it and so on and so on and so on, being a spokesperson for it for 10 years or whatever, you're not likely going to change it, because then you would have to rewind all that you did in the last 10 years and try to remake it somehow, right? So there's sort of a built-in kind of when it's sort of set in stone, you're not going to change it. People are not going to change, even if you can point out something that is fluffy in their argumentation. They will just reject you and say that you're stupid, or there's something wrong with you, or whatever, right? So, but these are the troubles in philosophy, that philosophy is all over the place, right? And it's also fractioned so that people can sit in their little pet subjects somewhere and come up with all sorts of shit, because it doesn't have to fit with the rest of what you can philosophize about, right? So they can create these some crazy philosophy over here that is not challenged, because it's not attempting to fit with the rest of what you can or should philosophize about in what you can call a treatise, right? So any serious good philosopher have to connect all the dots, so to say. They have to write about all subjects in philosophy, from the foundational start till they have a moral principle, in my opinion. If you're not attempting to go for that, I won't take you seriously, right? You can say, okay, these couple of years I have studied, thought about metaphysics fair enough. And in some years I'm going to do epistemology, fair enough, and so on, right? Okay, can't maybe take the all in at once, right? But if you're not trying to get to the whole picture, why would I take it seriously? I mean, I could take that part seriously and say, okay, I'm going to take a look at that metaphysics or whatever it is, right? But as a philosopher, as such, the quality of you in the stature of your as a known philosopher, I'm not taking it as seriously because it's easier to come up with some harebrained part philosophy that doesn't have to fit with the rest, right? If you're only doing metaphysics, you might be coming up with all sorts of shit that would have to be rejected when you get further down the line into epistemology and ethics and so on, because it doesn't work, right? At some point there was something that sticks out and says whatever something, right? But it won't stick out because you're not going further from metaphysics. So just my thoughts, right?
Seclude myself in some measure from the commerce and society of men, which is so agreeable, and that I must torture my brains with subtleties and sophistries at the very time that I cannot satisfy myself concerning the reasonableness of so painful an application, nor have any tolerable prospect of arriving by its means at truth and certainty. Under what obligation do I lie of making such an abuse of time? And to what end can it serve either for the service of mankind or for my own private interest? No, if I must be a fool, as all those who reason or believe anything certainly are, my follies shall at least be natural and agreeable. Where I strive against my inclination, I shall have a good reason for my resistance, and will no more be led a-wandering into such dreary solitudes and rough passages as I have hitherto met with. These are the sentiments of my spleen and indolence, and indeed I must confess that philosophy has nothing to oppose to them, and expects a victory more from the returns of a serious good-humoured disposition than from the force of reason and conviction. In all the incidents of life, we ought still to preserve our scepticism. If we believe that fire warms or water refreshes, it is only because it costs us too much pains to think otherwise. Nay, if we are philosophers, it ought only to be upon sceptical principles, and from an inclination which we feel to the employing ourselves after that manner. Where reason is lively and mixes itself with some propensity, it ought to be assented to. Where it does not, it never can have any title to operate upon us. At the time, therefore, that I am tired with amusement and company, and have indulged a reverie in my chamber, or in a solitary walk by a riverside, I feel my mind all collected within itself, and am naturally inclined to carry my view into all those subjects about which I have met with so many disputes in the course of my reading and conversation. I cannot forbear having a curiosity to be acquainted with the principles of moral good and evil, the nature and foundation of government, and the cause of those several passions and inclinations which actuate and govern me. I am uneasy to think I approve of one object and disapprove of another, call one thing beautiful and another deformed, decide concerning truth and falsehood, reason and folly, without knowing upon what principles I proceed. I am concerned for the condition of the learned world, which lies under such a deplorable ignorance in all these particulars. I feel an ambition to arise in me of contributing to the instruction of mankind, and of acquiring a name by my inventions and discoveries. These sentiments spring up naturally in my present disposition, and should I endeavor to banish
I'll have to tell him that he did acquire himself a name, right? And it has only, as far as I understand, it has only been solidifying through the centuries, and in particular in the recent 120 years or so, right? Since sort of the turn of the last century, when after psychology and all these kind of things, people sort of, hey, what about Hume? He was talking about this stuff 200 years ago, right? So it's sort of an interesting. It's interesting too. What is a bit fascinating for me is that I can imagine him sitting there in his solitary room, having these thoughts and looking out his window and pressing his eye to know what happens when I do this, and oh, it's double, and right? Feeling his fire, okay, I have these. It's like I'm feeling. I have a sense that there's a person talking to me, and I like that feeling when it he's trying to be precise, and he has a bit of an academic language to him, right? And I'm okay. I might want it a little more straight up, right? Personally, but still, very much I feel that it's a person talking to me. It's a one-to-one discussion, though he's referring to some philosophers and sort of he has been reading, obviously, right? And apparently, as a very young man, he got tired of studying law or whatever he did, and I don't blame him, honestly. Even back then, there were possibly a lot of laws that you need to understand in order to do that kind of thing. But he started reading philosophy, so he's very read about this, right? And it was sort of I guess it's just a part of that. I guess there's some human beings when they're bitten by the bug of philosophy, it just won't go away, right? I feel like that when it suddenly dawned on me, like 12 years ago or somewhere around there, right? 13 years maybe. It was like there was nothing else. In the first bit, I was like, I was studying something, taking some engineering, doing some engineering and so on university. I had to leave that because I simply couldn't. I all of a sudden had this. I don't care about this. This is fucking boring. This is not important, man. Right? What? Fuck that. Molecule chemistry, whatever I was doing, right? No understanding, epistemology, man, right? What does it mean to know, right? I mean, it was like, holy shit, this is important. And why have nobody ever told me about philosophy, man, right? So it was like mental explosion and passion that was like diverted in one direction. And I haven't looked back since, right? I live and breathe philosophy, to be honest, right? It's a very, very big. It's as important to me as eating and sleeping, right? I mean, I can't live without it. I would, but decompose or something like that. I will, dwindle into nothing if I weren't able to do some kind of philosophy, right? It's just something my mind wants to do, and I'm following along, basically, right? I mean, it's not like I'm not addicted. But I just can't help it, and it just something that it feels good. I mean, it feels good to philosophize, and if you had said that to me like 15 or 20 years ago, as yeah, you will be completely swallowed by philosophy, and I would have said, "What are you crazy, man? Right? Philosophy, man? That's so boring. It's Aristotle or whatever, right? These old dudes or so on." and weirdos, Søren Kierkegaard, and no, that's too boring for me. I don't that and that's not for me. I like science and whatever, right? And when it hit me, it was like, holy shit, man. And I honestly, and I'm rambling a bit here, right? I honestly don't know what the hell got into me, right? I understand why and so on from a intellectual point, but there was at some point it just the importance of philosophy just dawned on me, right? And I don't know, I'm not sure what exactly it was, but it suddenly dawned on me. It was like an epiphany moment or something like that. I don't know how else to put it. And it was like I haven't looked back since, right? I'm just ground philosophy, what is it, grinded philosophy for 12 years now, right? And I mean, I just can't stop, right? And I'm not going to stop. I keep going until the bitter end, so to say, as they say, right? So, and I think, Hume is sort of in the same situation. He can't help it, right? When he got bitten by the philosophy bug, it was like studying law was the most stupid thing he could. I mean, he would probably have lost. If he had had some interest in it, when he really got bitten by that philosophy bug, I would suppose that he completely lost his interest in other intellectual avenues. When he got that, because it's so foundational, it's what everything it's what you possibly should base everything on in your life, right? And philosophy is mostly for your own sake. I mean, it's not in order to come up with how to explain something for somebody else. That could also be a part of it, but it's mainly getting a grip on your own experience, right? And at some point it might dawn on you, and there might also be some you have an inclination towards doing philosophy that might help it, right? Maybe I have a certain skill in that direction, and I have really a passion, but it's the passion that rules the game. That, as Hume would also say, it's not because I sat down one day, I have to check up on philosophy because I need to get to a conclusion about this, that, and reasoning. No, it was the passion that drives it, right? As much as I want to reason about it, it is the passion that drives it. Okay, let's get back to Hume.
Them by attaching myself to any other business or diversion, I feel I should be a loser in point of pleasure, and this is the origin of my philosophy. But even suppose this curiosity and ambition should not transport me into speculations without the sphere of common life, it would necessarily happen that from my very weakness I must be led into such inquiries. It is certain that superstition is much more bold in its systems and hypotheses than philosophy. And while the latter contents itself with assigning new causes and principles to the phenomena which appear in the visible world, the former opens a world of its own and presents us with scenes and beings and objects which are altogether new. Since, therefore, it is almost impossible for the mind of man to rest, like those of beasts, in that narrow circle of objects which are the subject of daily conversation and action, we ought only to deliberate concerning the choice of our guide, and ought to prefer that which is safest and most agreeable. And in this respect, I make bold to recommend philosophy, and shall not scruple to give it the preference to superstition of every kind or denomination. For as superstition arises naturally and easily from the popular opinions of mankind, it seizes more strongly on the mind, and is often able to disturb us in the conduct of our lives and actions. Philosophy, on the contrary, if just, can present us only with mild and moderate sentiments, and if false and extravagant, Its opinions are merely the objects of a cold and general speculation, and seldom go so far as to interrupt the course of our natural propensities. The cynics are an extraordinary instance of philosophers who, from reasonings purely philosophical, ran into as great extravagancies of conduct as any monk or dervish that ever was in the world. Generally speaking, the errors in religion are dangerous, those in philosophy only ridiculous.
That's also a famous quote. Religion are dangerous. Those in philosophy are only ridiculous. Yeah, yeah. If you screw up your religion, it's dangerous. Yeah, and in philosophy, it's only ridiculous when you create some harebrained philosophy, right? Yeah, there's something to that, maybe, right? And what it relies on also basically understanding that religion is not a personal thinking, right? It's about telling other people what to do based on some kind of magical story of some kind, right? Jesus thinking he's the son of a god, and it's like, shut up, you crazy sandal warrior, right? It's and God is coming to remove the Romans, and and I was, maybe he didn't say that, but then it ends up, some stories that are 50, 60, 60, 80, 90 years old and even more, that has sort of been condensed into a Bible that has been translated and rewritten and recomposed and censored, and it's like, oh, give me a break, man, right? No, it's a kind of child abuse, right? And it's always the crazy people that get the microphone, right? It's always those who have come up with some, hey, I have some, yeah, it's a fantastic, there's a God who's going to save us all, and just you wait. It's all these crazy people, rather than those say, why don't you just sit down and think about how you work in your mind and how you understand that, and give me a presentation of it in a few days. Go think for yourself, right? No. I want to think there's a heaven after I die, and I can meet my parents, and it does. Oh, it's sort of, who was it that called it a kind of, opium for the brain, or opium for the. It's like, it's sort of a sleeping pill that does the opposite of philosophy. It shuts down your brain in areas where you should think for yourself, right? So.
I am sensible that these two cases of the strength and weakness of the mind will not comprehend all mankind, and that there are in England, in particular, many honest gentlemen who, being always employed in their domestic affairs or amusing themselves in common recreations, have carried their thoughts very little beyond those objects which are every day exposed to their senses. And indeed, of such as these, I pretend not to make philosophers, nor do I expect them either to be associates in these researches or auditors of these discoveries. They do well to keep themselves in their present situation, and instead of refining them into philosophers, I wish we could communicate to our founders of systems a share of this gross earthy mixture as an ingredient which they commonly stand much in need of, and which would serve to temper those fiery particles of which they are composed. While a warm imagination is allowed to enter into philosophy, and hypotheses embraced merely for being specious and agreeable, we can never have any steady principles nor any sentiments which will suit with common practice and experience. But were these hypotheses once removed, we might hope to establish a system or set of opinions which, if not true, for that perhaps is too much to be hoped for, might at least be satisfactory to the human mind, and might stand the test of the most critical examination. Nor should we despair of attaining this end because of the many chimerical systems which have successively arisen and decayed away among men, would we consider the shortness of that period wherein these questions have been the subjects of inquiry and reasoning. 2,000 years with such long interruptions and under such mighty discouragements are a small space of time to give any tolerable perfection to the sciences. And perhaps we are still in too early an age of the world to discover any principles which will bear the examination of the latest posterity. For my part, my only hope is that I may contribute a little to the advancement of knowledge by giving in some particulars a different turn to the speculations of philosophers, and pointing out to them more distinctly those subjects where alone they can expect assurance and conviction. Human nature is the only science of man, and yet has been hitherto the most neglected. It will be sufficient for me if I can bring it a little more into fashion, and the hope of this serves to compose my temper from that spleen, and invigorate it from that indolence which sometimes prevail upon me. If the reader finds himself in the same easy disposition, let him follow me in my future speculations. If not, let him follow his inclination, and wait the returns of application and good humor. The conduct of a man who studies philosophy in this careless manner is more truly skeptical than that of one who, feeling in himself an inclination to it, is yet so overwhelmed with doubts and scruples as totally to reject it. A true skeptic will be diffident of his philosophical doubts as well as of his philosophical conviction, and will never refuse any innocent satisfaction which offers itself upon account of either of them. Nor is it only proper we should in general indulge our inclination in the most elaborate philosophical researches, notwithstanding our skeptical principles, but also that we should yield to that propensity which inclines us to be positive and certain in particular points, according to the light in which we survey them in any particular instant. It is easier to forbear all examination and inquiry than to check ourselves in so natural a propensity, and guard against that assurance which always arises from an exact and full survey of an object. On such an occasion, we are apt not only to forget our skepticism, but even our modesty too, and make use of such terms as these: it is evident, it is certain, it is undeniable, which a due deference to the public ought, perhaps, to prevent. I may have fallen into this fault after the example of others, but I here enter a caveat against any objections which may be offered on that head, and declare that such expressions were extorted from me by the present view of the object, and imply no dogmatical spirit nor conceited idea of my own judgment, which are sentiments that I am sensible can become nobody, and a skeptic still less than any other. End of file 39.
Okay, so that was the end of book one, and book two is called Of the Passions, and part one will kick off with Of Pride and Humility. Now, yeah, well, I guess I'll just say, okay, so far so good. It has been an interesting listen, and I hope my comments is also that they are also, useful and helpful to maybe get some interesting, different notion about how to understand Hume and maybe some of the limitations of his philosophy, and where he maybe lacks something and where he's doing something that is interesting and solid, and reflecting about it, right? Um, and this is also the first time I read the book, so this is sort of also an exercise for me, right? So I don't want to be too harsh on it, because it's not just an average YouTube video where you claim to have found the answer to everything. He is sufficiently clear about his the shortcomings possibly of his philosophy. He's skeptical and he's doubtful sometimes, and sometimes you want to throw all of his books and papers into the fire and say fuck it all, right? And it's kind of an honest person doing some honest philosophy. I like that basic notion, and I hope to get more of it in book 2. So let's meet there. See you in the next one.